My name is Sarah, and at 33 I thought I knew what rock bottom felt like, until the night I watched my children stare at nearly empty plates while my sister's family feasted. I'm a single mother who's worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and when my parents told my kids to wait for crumbs at that family dinner, I did something I'd never done before. I walked out. What happened in the minutes after we left that house would change everything, not just for my family, but for my children's lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. The detective's words still echo in my mind. You left just in time. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment below telling me where you're from. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway as Sarah's beat-up sedan crunched to a stop in front of her parents' house. She killed the engine and sat there for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Knuckles white with tension, she didn't want her children to see. "We're here," 9-year-old Ellie chirped from the back seat, already unbuckling her seatbelt with the enthusiasm only a child could muster for a visit to grandparents' house. "Can we play in Grandpa's yard?" 6-year-old Noah asked, pressing his face against the window. Sarah forced a smile as she met her son's eyes in the rearview mirror. "We'll see, baby. Remember what we talked about. Best behavior, okay?" The children nodded eagerly, oblivious to the knot of anxiety tightening in their mother's chest. Sarah was 33 years old, a single mother working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. And this was the first time in months she'd gathered the courage to bring her children back to this house. The house where she'd grown up. The house where she'd always been made to feel like she wasn't quite enough. As they approached the front door, it swung open before Sarah could knock. Her mother, Martha, stood in the doorway, a thin, severe woman in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun that seemed to match the pinched expression on her face. "Sarah," Martha said, her tone polite but lacking any genuine warmth. "You're early." "Only by 15 minutes, Mom," Sarah replied, herding her children forward. "Kids, say hello to Grandma." Ellie and Noah chorused their greetings with bright smiles that weren't quite returned. Martha's gaze swept over them with something that looked uncomfortably close to assessment, as if measuring their worth. "Come in, I suppose. Your father's in the den." The house smelled the same as it always had, lemon polish and something vaguely antiseptic, as if warmth itself might be a contaminant. Sarah's father, Leonard, emerged from the den as they entered the living room. He was a barrel-chested man with thinning hair and the same cool, distant eyes that Sarah remembered from her childhood. "Sarah?" he nodded. "Children." Before the stilted conversation could continue, the sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Through the window, Sarah watched a gleaming black SUV pull up, the kind of vehicle that cost more than she made in 2 years. Her stomach clenched. "Oh, good. Candace is here," Martha said, and for the first time genuine warmth entered her voice. Sarah's sister swept into the house moments later like a force of nature. Candace was 3 years younger, but looked like she belonged in a different tax bracket entirely. Her honey blonde hair was professionally styled, her designer dress fit her like a second skin, and her husband Greg followed behind her carrying their 2 children's overnight bags. Bags that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Mother! Father!" Candace embraced their parents with the kind of affection Sarah had stopped expecting years ago. "We brought the Merlot you like, and Greg picked up some wonderful steaks from that new butcher." "Candace, darling, you shouldn't have," Martha cooed, but she was already reaching for the wine bottle like it was a prize. Emily and Connor, Candace's children, bounded into the room with the confidence of kids who knew they were adored. They were immediately swept up by their grandparents in hugs and exclamations of how much they'd grown. Ellie and Noah stood beside Sarah, suddenly very quiet. "And how are my other grandchildren?" Leonard asked, his tone perfunctory, as if remembering they were there at all was an effort. "We're good, Grandpa," Ellie said softly. The adults moved toward the dining room, and Sarah felt the familiar ache of invisibility settle over her shoulders. It was always like this. Candace at the center of attention, her achievements celebrated, her children praised, while Sarah and her kids existed in the margins, like footnotes in someone else's story. Dinner began with the kind of careful choreography that Sarah knew all too well. The table was set for 8, but even a casual glance revealed the hierarchy at work. 4 places were set with the good china, the kind with the delicate blue pattern that had been in Martha's family for generations. The other 4 plates were the everyday dishes, slightly chipped, practical rather than precious. Sarah watched as Martha brought out the food. Thick, beautiful steaks for Candace's family, perfectly seasoned, still sizzling. For her children, smaller portions appeared, and Martha's lips tightened as she set them down. "We didn't expect you quite so early, dear," Martha said, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "I'm afraid we're short on the prime cuts. There's plenty of bread, though, and some vegetables." Sarah felt her daughter's hand slip into hers under the table. She squeezed it gently, swallowing the words that wanted to rise in her throat. Ellie's plate held perhaps a third of what Emily had been served. Noah's portion was even smaller. "Oh, this looks amazing, Mom," Candace said, cutting into her steak with relish. She glanced across the table at Sarah's children and smirked. "My kids eat first. That's how it's always been, isn't it, Mother?" "Children need to learn patience," Leonard added, reaching for his wine glass. "Yours should understand that good things come to those who wait. They'll get what's left." Sarah felt the heat rising in her cheeks, but she said nothing. She watched as Noah stared down at his nearly empty plate, his lower lip beginning to tremble. Ellie sat very still, the way children do when they're trying not to cry, trying not to make things worse. The conversation flowed around them, Candace talking about Emily's acceptance into an exclusive private school, about Connor's tennis lessons, about their upcoming vacation to Aspen. Greg chimed in about his promotion, his new company car. Martha and Leonard listened with rapt attention, asking questions, offering congratulations, beaming with pride. No one asked about Sarah's job. No one asked how the kids were doing in school. No one seemed to notice that Ellie had stopped eating altogether. Sarah's mind drifted backward, the way it always did in this house. She remembered being 12 years old, watching Candace get a new bicycle for her birthday, while Sarah received a card with a lecture about fiscal responsibility. She remembered applying to colleges, scraping together application fees from her part-time job, while Candace had a college fund that paid for everything. She remembered her parents missing her high school graduation because they were attending Candace's cheerleading competition. "Mom?" Noah's small voice pulled her back to the present. "Can I have some more?" "There isn't any more, dear," Martha said before Sarah could respond. "You should have eaten what you were given." I did," Noah said, his voice barely a whisper. The family moved on to dessert, a beautiful layered cake that Martha had clearly spent hours preparing. Large slices were served to Candace's family. Smaller pieces appeared for Sarah's children. As Emily reached for her fork, it clattered to the floor. Martha was on her feet instantly, fussing over the girl, getting her a new fork, making sure she had everything she needed. Meanwhile, Noah had finished his tiny slice of cake and was quietly running his finger along the plate, trying to collect the last bits of frosting. Sarah's jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Guess your kids don't need much," Candace said with a laugh that was just a bit too sharp. "They're used to leftovers, aren't they?" The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even Greg looked uncomfortable. Leonard cleared his throat but said nothing. Martha busied herself with clearing plates. But Sarah heard it. The quiet sniffle from Noah, the way Ellie's breath caught as she tried not to cry. Something inside Sarah snapped. She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every head turned toward her. "We're leaving," she said, her voice steady and quiet. Don't be dramatic, Sarah, Leonard said, his tone dismissive. Sit down. Running away again? Candace muttered into her wine glass. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't trust herself to speak without saying things that couldn't be unsaid. Instead, she gathered her children, helping them from their chairs with gentle hands. Come on, babies, she whispered. Get your jackets. Sarah, really? Martha began. But Sarah was already moving toward the door, her children following. As they walked out into the cool evening air, Sarah heard Ellie's small, heartbroken voice. Mom, did we do something wrong? Sarah knelt down and pulled both children into a fierce hug. No, baby, never. Some people just forget what kindness is, and we don't have to stay where we're not valued. She buckled them into the car, hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. As she started the engine, thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and ominous. In her rearview mirror, Sarah saw the lights of her parents' house growing smaller. She didn't see Leonard inside, suddenly doubled over with a coughing fit. She didn't see Martha wave it off with irritation. She didn't see the pot of gravy on the counter, left uncovered, or the fly that had been buzzing around the kitchen, landing on the serving dishes. She drove in silence, her children quiet in the back seat, and tried to ignore the strange, unsettled feeling in her chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite guilt, but something else. Something that whispered that the universe had a way of balancing scales. Sarah's small apartment felt like a sanctuary when they finally got home. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms in an aging building on the edge of town, but it was theirs. Clean, safe, warm in all the ways that mattered. She made grilled cheese sandwiches for the kids, watching them eat with the kind of focus that broke her heart. They were still hungry. They'd left their grandparents' house hungry. Mom, Noah said through a mouthful of sandwich, will Grandpa and Grandma ever like us? Sarah set down her spatula and knelt beside her son's chair. Baby, this isn't about you. It's never been about you. Some grown-ups... She paused, searching for words a 6-year-old could understand. Some grown-ups have forgotten how to see what really matters. She hugged him tightly, then pulled Ellie in too. They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing together. After the children were in bed, Sarah sat at her small kitchen table with her journal, a habit she'd kept since high school, a way to process thoughts too heavy to carry. Her pen moved across the page in quick, angry strokes. They humiliated my babies. And I said nothing for too long. But something in me feels strange. Like justice is closer than I think. Like the universe is keeping score. She set down the pen and stared at the words, unsettled by them. She didn't believe in karma. Not really. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. 15 miles away, at Martha and Leonard's house, the dinner party continued, though the mood had soured slightly after Sarah's dramatic exit. She's always been so sensitive, Candace said, pouring herself another glass of wine. Can't take a joke. Never could, Leonard agreed, but he rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. Greg excused himself first, claiming he felt a bit nauseous. Must be the wine, Candace laughed, but her smile was strained. By midnight, Leonard was locked in the bathroom, violently ill. Martha woke to his groans and found him pale and sweating, clutching his stomach. It's just something you ate, she said, more annoyed than concerned. Take some antacid and come back to bed. But by morning, things had gotten worse. Martha woke to chaos. Leonard was still sick, now unable to keep anything down. From down the hall, she heard Candace's children crying. She rushed to their room and found both Emily and Connor complaining of terrible stomach pain. What's happening? Candace appeared in the doorway. her perfect hair disheveled, her face gray. "I feel awful, Mom, really awful." The house smelled wrong, a sour, spoiled stench that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. Martha traced it to the kitchen, where last night's leftovers still sat on the counter. The meat looked fine, but something about it made her stomach turn. The phone rang. It was Mrs. Halpern, their neighbor. "Martha, dear, I heard about the meat recall," Mrs. Halpern said, her voice tight with concern. "That farmer's market vendor you bought from? There's been a recall. E. coli contamination. It's been on the news all morning." Martha's blood ran cold. "Our meat was fine," she said automatically. But even as she said it, she remembered. Leonard had been so proud of the deal he'd gotten. Greg had bragged about knowing a guy who could get premium cuts wholesale. "You didn't eat any, did you?" Mrs. Halpern asked. Martha looked around her kitchen, at the congealing gravy, the leftover steak, the plates still in the sink. "Oh, God," she whispered. She hung up and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. Sarah woke to her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. Unknown number. She ignored it, rolling over to check on her kids through the open bedroom doors. They were sleeping peacefully, bathed in early morning sunlight. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Ellie's art supplies, helping her daughter work on a school project. Noah sat on the floor, building elaborate structures with his blocks. For the first time in days, their small home was filled with laughter. The phone rang again. Then again. Finally, it was a number she recognized. Candace. Sarah stared at the screen, her sister's name flashing. Some instinct told her not to answer. Not yet. She wasn't ready to be pulled back into that world, to be made to feel small again. She let it go to voicemail. But something nagged at her. An uncomfortable twist of intuition. Despite everything, these were her parents. Her sister. Old habits of guilt ran deep in the grooves of her heart. Minutes later, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail notification. Sarah pressed play, holding the phone to her ear. What she heard made her drop the phone like it had burned her. Screaming, crying, chaos. And beneath it all, her mother's voice, panicked and high. "Call 911, please. Someone call 911. "Mom." Ellie appeared in the doorway. "What's wrong?" Sarah's hands were shaking as she grabbed her keys. "Stay here with Noah. Mrs. Chen will come over. I'll call her from the car. Something's happened at Grandma's house." She drove faster than she should have, her heart pounding so hard, it felt like it might break through her ribs. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving everything washed clean and bright. But Sarah barely noticed. When she pulled up to her parents' house, the scene was like something from a nightmare. 2 ambulances sat in the driveway, lights flashing red and blue against the morning sky. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching with the kind of morbid fascination that tragedy always drew. The front door stood open, and through it, Sarah could see paramedics moving with urgent efficiency. She parked haphazardly and ran toward the house. A paramedic stopped her at the door. "Family?" "Daughter, what happened? Where are they?" "Your father's being loaded into the first ambulance now. Critical condition. Your mother and sister are being treated inside. 2 children, also sick but stable." Sarah pushed past him and into the house. The scene inside was surreal. Candace sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm morning, her skin gray and clammy. She was sobbing uncontrollably, barely coherent. "It's Dad," she gasped when she saw Sarah. "And Mom. And the kids. Everyone who ate." Sarah's brain was working too slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. "Ate what?" "Last night. The dinner." Candace clutched her stomach, her whole body trembling. "We're all sick. Really, really sick." A police officer approached, notebook in hand. He looked tired and grim. "Your family?" "Sarah Mitchell. I was here last night, but I left before dinner ended. You didn't eat with them? Sarah shook her head, something icy sliding down her spine. My kids and we left early. The officer nodded slowly. You're lucky then. Looks like food poisoning. Severe contamination, possibly from the meat. Your father's the worst. He ate the most, apparently. Through the window, Sarah watched as paramedics wheeled Leonard out on a stretcher. His skin had a gray, waxy quality, and his lips were blue. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought he might already be dead. Ellie and Noah. The thought hit her like a physical blow. If she hadn't walked out, if she'd swallowed her pride, let her children sit there hungry and humiliated, let them scrape their forks over empty plates while everyone else ate their fill, they would be in those ambulances now. Sick. Maybe dying. Ma'am, are you all right? The officer was looking at her with concern. Sarah realized she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face. But she didn't know if they were tears of grief or relief or some terrible combination of both. Candace grabbed Sarah's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You left, she said, and there was accusation in her voice, even through the pain. You left, and then this happened. Did you know? Sarah jerked away. No? Candace, I walked out because you were cruel to my children. That's all. I didn't. You cursed us. Candace's voice rose to a shriek. You were angry and you left and you cursed us. A paramedic intervened, gently but firmly pulling Candace away. Ma'am, you need to lie back down. You're in shock. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, her sister's accusation ringing in her ears. Around her, the investigation continued. Health inspectors had arrived, sealing off the kitchen with yellow tape, photographing the table, bagging evidence. She heard one of them say to another, Batch 73B, that's the recalled meat. Jesus, didn't they check the news? Sarah closed her eyes. The universe keeping score. Wasn't that what she'd written in her journal? But she hadn't meant this. She'd never wished for this. Had she? The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and bad coffee. Sarah sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, replaying the morning's events in an endless, torturous loop. Candace had been admitted for observation. Martha was stable but severely dehydrated from hours of vomiting. Emily and Connor were in the pediatric ward, sick but expected to recover. And Leonard was in intensive care. Touch and go, the doctor had said. The contamination had hit him hardest, combined with his age and underlying health conditions no one had known about. The next 24 hours would tell. Sarah had called Mrs. Chen to check on her kids. They were fine, playing games, asking when Mommy would be home. The normalcy of it felt obscene. A detective named Rollins approached her around noon. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes, and a notebook that had seen better days. Miss Mitchell, I have a few more questions if you don't mind. Sarah straightened. Of course. You left the dinner party last night. Can you tell me why? Sarah considered lying, or softening the truth, but she was too tired for anything but honesty. They were treating my children badly, giving them smaller portions, making them wait, saying cruel things. So I took my kids and left. Before the main course, we ate a little. My children had small portions of everything, but they were still hungry when we left. She paused. We didn't touch the steak. Or the gravy. Rollins made a note. That's probably what saved you. The preliminary analysis shows the contamination was primarily in the meat and anything that came in contact with it. Sarah felt lightheaded. So if I'd stayed, your children would likely be in this hospital right now. Rollins looked at her thoughtfully. Sometimes bad situations lead to good outcomes, in a roundabout way. After he left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts. Was it karma? Divine intervention? Blind luck? She didn't know. She only knew that the decision to protect her children's dignity had also protected their lives. Martha appeared in the waiting room around dinner time, moving slowly, an IV still attached to her arm. She looked decades older than she had yesterday, her face hollow and gray. "Sarah," she said quietly. Sarah stood but didn't approach. "Mom." They stared at each other across the waiting room. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't deserve what we did to you. Or your children." The apology hung in the air between them. Insufficient and too late, but real nonetheless. "I just wanted you to love them the way you loved Candace's kids," Sarah said, and her voice broke on the words. "That's all I ever wanted, for you to see them." "I know." Martha's eyes were red-rimmed. "I know that now." Outside the hospital, as the sun set over the parking lot, Sarah sat in her car and called her kids. They answered on video chat, their faces filling her screen with light and life and everything that mattered. "When are you coming home, Mommy?" Noah asked. "Soon, baby, very soon." That night, Sarah wrote in her journal again. "They told my kids to wait for Crumbs, but I walked away from that table, and in doing so, I saved them. Not from humiliation, from poison. The universe doesn't keep score, but maybe sometimes standing up for what's right aligns with staying safe. Maybe protecting their dignity and protecting their lives were always the same thing. I don't know if I believe in karma, but I believe in this. My children will never wait for Crumbs again. They will never be last. They will never be less than. I will make sure of it. Because love isn't about who gets the biggest piece. It's about making sure everyone at the table is fed. And if there's no room at the table for my children, then we'll build our own." She closed the journal and looked out her window at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, her parents lay in hospital beds. Her sister wrestled with guilt and illness, and her niece and nephew recovered from poisoning. And in her small apartment, her children slept safely, their bellies full, their hearts protected, their lives untouched by the tragedy that had consumed the family who treated them as less than. Sarah didn't feel victorious. She felt hollowed out and sad. But beneath the sadness was something else, a small, fierce flame of certainty. She had done the right thing, and that knowledge, however hard-won, was enough. Days passed. The investigation continued. News spread through the small town like wildfire. The contaminated meat had affected multiple families. The farmer's market vendor disappeared, never to be held accountable. The supplier was shut down, but only after 2 people in another county died from the same batch. Sarah attended her father's hospital bedside once. Leonard was conscious but weak, his skin paper-thin and his breath labored. When he saw her, something moved in his eyes that might have been regret. "We were wrong," he said, his voice barely audible, "to treat you that way. Your children." Sarah sat down beside the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "Yes," she said simply. "You were. I wanted the best for everyone," Leonard continued, his words coming slowly. "That dinner, I told your mother to spare no expense. I wanted Candace's family to feel welcomed, to feel like they had the best." "And my family?" Sarah asked quietly. "What did you want us to feel?" Leonard was silent for a long time. Finally, he looked away. "I don't know. I suppose I never thought about it." And there it was. The truth that hurt more than any insult. They hadn't mistreated her children out of malice. They simply hadn't thought about them at all. Sarah stood to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at her father. "The best dinner you could provide almost killed you all. Maybe next time try providing love instead. It's free and it doesn't have an expiration date." The final piece of the puzzle came together when health inspectors released their report. The meat had been purchased from a discount supplier that Greg had recommended, someone he knew through work who could get restaurant quality at wholesale prices. No one had checked the source, no one had verified the permits, and no one had been watching the news, where the recall had been announced 2 days before the dinner party. Pride and carelessness, in equal measure, had poisoned them all. When Candace learned the truth, that it was her husband's cost-cutting that had led to the disaster, she broke down completely. She showed up at Sarah's apartment one evening, her designer clothes replaced with jeans and a sweater, her face bare of makeup. "I need to tell you something," she said when Sarah opened the door. They sat in Sarah's tiny living room while the kids did homework at the kitchen table. Candace stared at her hands. "I pressured Mom and Dad to rewrite their will," she confessed, "to cut you out completely. They were going to sign it the next day. After that dinner." Sarah felt the words like a physical blow, but somehow she wasn't surprised. "I've spent my whole life competing with you," Candace continued, tears streaming down her face. "Even though I always won. Even though they always chose me. It was never enough. I always needed to make sure you had less. And I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." Sarah looked at her sister, really looked at her, and saw not the golden child she'd always resented, but a broken woman who'd built her worth on comparison and found it crumbling. "I forgive you," Sarah said, and meant it. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean going back to how things were." Candace nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, I just needed you to know. About the will. About everything." After her sister left, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment and felt something shift inside her. The anger that had lived in her chest for so many years was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt like freedom. Her children would never know that dinner table. They would never sit hungry while others feasted. They would never wait for crumbs. Because Sarah had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes walking away from the table isn't about giving up your place. Sometimes it's about refusing to accept crumbs when you and your children deserve a feast. And if the people at that table couldn't see your worth, then the problem wasn't you. It was them. Sarah closed her journal that night with a final entry. "They begged for help minutes after we left. But I didn't cause their suffering, I just refused to participate in mine. There's a difference. There's always been a difference. My children are safe. They are loved. They are fed. Not with scraps, but with abundance. Not with leftovers, but with the best I have to give. That's all that matters. That's everything that matters. Tomorrow we start building our own table. And everyone will have a place." 3 weeks had passed since that terrible night, and the town was still buzzing with whispers. Sarah felt them everywhere she went. At the grocery store, at Ellie's school pickup, at the post office. Sometimes the whispers were sympathetic. Sometimes they carried an edge of suspicion. And sometimes they were just curious, the way people are curious about tragedy when it doesn't touch them directly. The hospital had called that morning. Leonard was awake and asking to see her. Sarah stood in her bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror, trying to decide if she had the strength for this. Part of her wanted to refuse. Part of her wanted to let him lie there wondering if she'd come, the way she'd spent her whole childhood wondering if he'd notice her. But there was another part, the part that Ellie and Noah had awakened in her, that knew she had to face this. Not for him, for herself. She called Mrs. Chen to watch the kids and drove to the hospital alone. Leonard looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical condition. The machines beeped steadily around him, and when he saw Sarah enter, something flickered in his eyes that might have been relief or fear or both. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse. "I came," Sarah replied, taking a seat in the chair by his bed but not moving any closer. They sat in silence for a long moment. Through the window, Sarah could see the parking lot, the trees beyond it beginning to show their autumn colors. Life continuing, indifferent to the small dramas playing out in hospital rooms. "The doctors say I'll recover," Leonard said finally. "Eventually, but it was close. For a while there, they thought." "I know," Sarah said. She'd heard it all from the nurses, the updates trickling through Candace. "Your mother told me what Candace confessed to you. About the will." Leonard's hands trembled on the thin hospital blanket. "I'm ashamed of that. Of all of it." Sarah felt the familiar anger rising, but kept her voice level. "Why? That's what I've never understood. Why was I always less? What did I do that was so wrong?" Leonard was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You weren't wrong. You were just different. You asked questions, you challenged us. Candace always did what we wanted, became what we expected. You wanted to be your own person." He closed his eyes. "We punished you for having a backbone." The admission hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open. Not with pain, but with the strange relief that comes from finally hearing the truth, even when it hurts. "I could have been both, you know," she said quietly. "Your daughter and my own person. You never gave me the chance to try." "I know that now." Sarah stood up, preparing to leave. She'd heard what she came to hear, and she wasn't sure she could take much more. "Sarah," Leonard called out, and she paused at the door. "Your children, they're good kids. Kind. Patient even when they shouldn't have to be. You've raised them right, despite everything we failed to give you." For the first time since entering the room, Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As she walked out of the hospital, Sarah passed a group of nurses at the station. One of them was talking quietly to another, unaware that Sarah could hear. "Contaminated batch killed 2 people over in Millbrook. Can you imagine? The family that got sick here was lucky, really. Especially lucky that the daughter with the little ones left before eating much." "I heard someone saying she knew about the contamination," the other nurse replied. "That's why she left early." Sarah kept walking, her jaw tight, but the words followed her like ghosts. The whispers grew louder over the next few days. It started small, a comment at the coffee shop, a pointed look at the pharmacy. But by the end of the week, Sarah could feel the weight of suspicion everywhere she went. Someone had apparently told someone else who told someone else that the estranged daughter had stormed out just before the family got sick. In a small town, that was enough to start a wildfire of speculation. She was picking up Ellie from school when it happened. Another mother, Jessica Hayes, was standing near the pickup line with her usual group. As Sarah approached, she heard Jessica say, just loud enough to be heard, "Her family gets poisoned right after she leaves in a huff? That's convenient timing, don't you think?" Sarah felt her face flush hot. She wanted to confront them, to explain, but Ellie was already running toward her with a painting she'd made, her face bright with pride. Sarah wouldn't let these people steal this moment from her daughter. "Look, Mom, I made us at our house." Ellie held up the painting, crude but earnest, showing 3 stick figures around a table, all with big smiles. "It's beautiful, baby," Sarah said, pulling her daughter close. "Let's get Noah and go home." But as they walked to the car, she heard Jessica's voice again. "Just saying seems suspicious. Maybe the police should look into it more carefully." That night, Detective Rollins showed up at Sarah's apartment. She'd been expecting it, dreading it, but trying to prepare herself nonetheless. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm sorry to bother you at home," he said, and he did look genuinely apologetic. "But there have been some questions raised, and I need to address them officially." Sarah invited him in, sent the kids to their room to play, and sat across from him at her small kitchen table. "People are saying I knew about the contamination," she said flatly, "that I left on purpose because I knew everyone would get sick." Rollins pulled out his notebook. "Did you have any knowledge of the meat recall before that dinner?" "No, I don't watch much news. I'm too busy working and taking care of my kids. And I didn't even know where the meat came from until after everything happened." "Why did you leave the dinner early?" Sarah took a deep breath and told him everything. The unequal portions, the cruel comments, the years of being treated as lesser, the look on her children's faces as they sat there hungry and humiliated. "I left to protect my children's dignity," she finished. "That's all. I had no idea about any contamination. How could I? I don't know anything about meat suppliers or recalls or any of it." Rollins nodded slowly, making notes. "The timeline supports your story. The recall was announced 2 days before the dinner, but it wasn't major news. Mostly industry alerts and a small mention in the local paper. Your family apparently never checked. And the contamination report shows the meat was compromised at the source, nothing to do with how it was prepared or served." "So I'm cleared?" Sarah asked, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "You were never really under suspicion, Ms. Mitchell. Not officially, but you might want to keep your distance from your family for a while. Grief can make people look for someone to blame, and you're an easy target." After he left, Sarah sat in the dark kitchen, listening to her children's laughter from the other room. She felt hollowed out, exhausted by the constant need to defend herself, to prove she wasn't the villain in a story she'd never wanted to be part of. The local paper ran a story 2 days later. "Family struck by tragedy after estranged daughter walks out before dinner." Sarah read it 3 times, each reading making her angrier. The article was carefully worded to avoid direct accusation, but the implication was clear. They painted her as the black sheep of the family, the troubled daughter who'd always caused problems, who'd left her family in anger right before catastrophe struck. They didn't mention that her children had been given scraps. They didn't mention years of favoritism and cruelty. They didn't mention that walking out had saved her children's lives. At the hospital, Martha's condition had stabilized, but her mind seemed to have cracked under the weight of what happened. She began having episodes where she'd cry out that Sarah had cursed them, that Sarah's anger had brought bad luck to the house. The nurses tried to calm her, explaining that it was the stress, the trauma, the medication. But Martha's words escaped the hospital walls and spread through town like poison of their own kind. Candace called Sarah, her voice thick with tears and exhaustion. "Mom's not doing well mentally," she said. "She keeps saying you cursed us. I told her that's crazy. I told the nurses it's not true, but Sarah, people are starting to believe it." "I can't control what people believe," Sarah said, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "I didn't curse anyone, I just left. That's all I did, I left." "I know that. And I told the police the truth, that you had every right to leave, that we were awful to you and your kids. But the truth doesn't always matter in places like this, does it?" After they hung up, Sarah broke down for the first time since the whole nightmare began. She sat on her bathroom floor and sobbed, great, wrenching sobs that tore through her chest. All she'd done was protect her children. All she'd done was refuse to let them be treated as less than. And somehow she'd become the villain. Ellie found her there and wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck. "You did the right thing, Mom," she whispered, and Sarah wondered how a 9-year-old could be so wise. "You protected us. That's what moms do." Sarah held her daughter tight and let herself believe it, just for a moment. The evidence that cleared Sarah came from an unexpected source. Detective Rollins returned a week later with lab results and a thin smile. "You're officially cleared of everything," he said, handing her a document. "The contamination was traced back to the supplier. a company called Premium Meats Direct that was operating without proper permits. The batch your family consumed had E. coli levels that were off the charts. You and your children were spared because you barely touched the main course. So everyone knows now? Sarah asked. Everyone knows I had nothing to do with it? Rollins hesitated. The official investigation does. Whether that translates to public opinion? He shrugged. Small towns have long memories and love their gossip. But for what it's worth, you saved your kids by leaving. That's not just good parenting. That's divine timing. After he left, Sarah called Candace. Her sister answered on the first ring. The police just left here too, Candace said before Sarah could speak. They told me everything. About the supplier, about Greg's contact being unlicensed, about how the meat should never have been sold for consumption. Her voice broke. This is our fault. Mine and Greg's. We wanted to show off, to have the best dinner, and we almost killed everyone. Sarah didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to rage, to tell Candace that yes, it was her fault, that her constant need to be superior had poisoned more than just one dinner. But another part of her just felt tired. Candace, I need you to do something for me, Sarah said quietly. Anything. I need you to tell people the truth. Not the police truth. Everyone already knows that. I need you to tell people why I left. I need you to tell them what you said to my children, what Mom and Dad did. I need the town to know that I walked out because my kids were being humiliated, not because I knew about poisoned meat. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, quietly, okay, I'll tell them. I'll tell everyone. Candace kept her word. She called the newspaper and gave an interview that ran the next day. I was cruel to my sister's children, and I'm ashamed. In it, Candace detailed the dinner, the unequal portions, the mocking comments, the years of favoritism. She explained that Sarah had left not out of spite or foreknowledge, but out of a mother's instinct to protect her children from further humiliation. She took full responsibility for the contaminated meat, explaining that it was her husband's cost-cutting that had led them to an unlicensed supplier. The article went viral in their small town and beyond. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted. Sarah was no longer the suspicious, estranged daughter. She was the mother who'd stood up for her children and accidentally saved their lives. People stopped whispering when she walked by. Some even apologized. Jessica Hayes approached her at school pickup, looking embarrassed. I'm sorry for what I said, she mumbled. I didn't know the whole story. Sarah just nodded. She didn't have the energy to be gracious, but she also didn't have the energy to hold grudges. Candace came to visit a few days later, and they sat on Sarah's small porch while the kids played in the yard. For the first time in their lives, they talked honestly about their childhood, about their parents, about the competition that had been bred into them. I've been thinking, Candace said, watching Emily and Connor play with Ellie and Noah. We were taught to compete for love, like there wasn't enough to go around. But there was. There always was. Mom and Dad they made us fight for scraps when they could have given us a feast. Sarah looked at her sister and saw, perhaps for the first time, an ally instead of an adversary. I'm trying to teach my kids differently, Sarah said. That love isn't finite, that you don't have to diminish someone else to shine. Candace wiped her eyes. Will you teach me too? It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. The wounds were too deep, too old. But it was a beginning. Months passed, and Sarah decided to do something she'd been thinking about since the night of the dinner. She started a small catering business from her home called Second Chance's Kitchen. Her focus was simple: healthy, safe, home-cooked meals for struggling families in town. She charged based on what people could afford, and for those who couldn't pay, she provided meals for free. Every meal was prepared with meticulous care, every ingredient checked and double-checked. Mrs. Halpern, the neighbor who'd warned Martha about the meat recall, became her first regular customer. "You've got a gift, dear," Mrs. Halpern said, sampling Sarah's chicken soup. "And more than that, you've got a story. People need to hear it. Not the tragedy part, the resilience part, the part where you turned pain into purpose." Word spread quickly. Families who'd once whispered about Sarah now ordered from her. Her food became known not just for its taste, but for what it represented. The woman who'd walked away from cruelty and survived, who'd protected her children and then turned her experience into something that helped others. At Ellie's school, her daughter's artwork was chosen for a special display. It was the painting she'd made weeks earlier, the one showing their family around the table, all smiling. Beneath it, Ellie had written in her careful 9-year-old script, "Mommy kept us safe." Sarah stood in the school hallway, staring at that painting, and felt tears stream down her face. But they were different tears this time. Not tears of pain or anger or exhaustion. Tears of pride, of healing, of hope. Candace came to see the painting too, bringing her kids. They stood together in that hallway, two sisters who'd spent their lives competing, now just trying to understand. "I'm volunteering at the homeless shelter," Candace said quietly. "With the kids, teaching them that having privilege means using it to help others, not to put others down." Sarah reached out and squeezed her sister's hand. "That's good. That's really good." "I'm trying to be better," Candace said. "It's hard, unlearning everything we were taught. But losing everything, almost losing Dad, seeing the kids so sick, watching Greg's career implode when the supplier scandal came out, it made me realize what matters." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "Being able to look at yourself in the mirror, being someone your kids can be proud of, not just someone who buys them things." Candace looked at the painting. "You've always been that person. I'm just starting to figure it out." Martha came to visit 6 months after the incident. She was thinner, older looking, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd learned how fragile life could be. She arrived at Sarah's apartment alone, without warning, and stood at the door looking uncertain, a look Sarah had never seen on her mother's face before. "May I come in?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stood aside and let her enter. The kids were at school, the apartment was quiet, and Sarah put on a pot of tea, the ritual of hospitality too ingrained to ignore, even now. They sat at the small kitchen table, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "I came to apologize," Martha said finally. "Not the apology I gave in the hospital, when I was scared and medicated and not thinking clearly. A real apology." Sarah waited, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. "I thought love meant control," Martha continued, her voice shaking. "I thought being a good mother meant shaping my daughters into what I wanted them to be. And when you refused to be shaped, when you insisted on being yourself, I punished you for it. And I taught Candace to do the same." "Why?" Sarah asked, the question she'd been carrying for 33 years. "Why couldn't you just love us both as we were?" Martha's face crumpled. "Because I was raised the same way. My mother favored my sister, and I spent my whole life trying to win her approval. I swore I'd never do that to my children. But then you were born so independent, so sure of yourself even as a little girl, and I didn't know how to reach you. So instead of trying, I chose the easier path. I loved the child who was easy to love and punished the one who made me work for it." The honesty was brutal, and Sarah felt it like a blow. But beneath the pain was something else. Understanding, maybe. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. "I'm sorry," Martha whispered. "I'm so sorry. And I know that's not enough. I know I can't undo the years of making you feel less than, but I want to try to do better. If you'll let me." Sarah looked at her mother, really looked at her, and saw not the intimidating figure of her childhood, but a broken woman trying to piece herself back together. "I'm making lunch," Sarah said finally. "Fresh bread and soup. Stay. Eat with me." It was a small thing, an ordinary thing, but as Sarah moved around her kitchen preparing the meal, she felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't absolution. It wasn't a magical healing of old wounds. But it was a start. She set the table carefully. 2 plates, equal portions, good napkins. She brought out the bread, still warm from the oven, and ladled soup into bowls. Martha stared at the food, tears streaming down her face. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's just lunch," Sarah replied, but she smiled a little as she said it. They ate together in Sarah's small kitchen, and it wasn't perfect. The conversation was stilted, the silences uncomfortable. But they were both trying, and sometimes that's all you can ask. As Martha was leaving, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, "you used to feed me last. Now I'm eating what you made first." Sarah hadn't thought about it that way, but she realized it was true. "Funny how things come around," she said. Martha's face was serious. "It's not funny. It's justice. The kind that heals instead of hurts." She hesitated. "That's what you've built here, isn't it? A place where everyone gets fed first, where everyone matters." "I'm trying," Sarah said. "You're succeeding." After her mother left, Sarah stood in her kitchen and looked around at her small, humble home. The walls needed paint. The furniture was secondhand. The appliances were old. But the table was always set. The food was always plentiful. And her children never, ever had to wait for crumbs. That evening, as she washed dishes with Ellie beside her drying, Noah called out from the living room. "Mom, come see what I built." He'd constructed an elaborate tower from his blocks, and at the base of it, he'd placed his toy figures in a circle. "It's everyone eating together," he explained proudly. "Everyone gets the same." Sarah knelt down and pulled both her children close. "Remember when we had nothing?" she asked them. "We always had each other," Ellie said simply. "That's why we made it." Sarah felt the truth of those words settle in her bones. Yes, that's exactly why they'd made it. 1 year after the incident, Sarah stood at the family graveyard with her children. Leonard had passed away 3 months earlier, not from the poisoning, but from complications that had weakened his system beyond recovery. The funeral had been quiet, well-attended, and surprisingly healing. Sarah placed flowers on his grave and whispered, "I forgive you." She didn't know if she meant it yet, not fully, but she was trying, and that counted for something. The local journalist who'd written the original suspicious article reached out to do a follow-up piece. Sarah agreed, but only if she could tell the whole story. Not just the tragedy, but what came after. The article ran with a new headline, "From Crumbs to Community: How One Mother's Stand Created a Movement of Kindness." In it, the journalist revealed something Sarah hadn't known. The contaminated meat supplier had been operating illegally for years, but because they offered such good prices, people kept using them despite red flags. Greg's contact was actually part of an investigation. The meat that had poisoned Sarah's family had also made dozens of others sick across 3 counties. But there was something else. Greg had brought the meat to dinner specifically to impress Leonard and Martha, to show that he could provide the best for cheap. It was his arrogance and corner-cutting that had led to the disaster, not Martha's cooking or any curse. When Sarah read this final detail, something inside her relaxed completely. The last vestiges of superstition, the tiny part of her that had wondered if somehow her anger had caused it, disappeared. This was just human error and corporate greed. Nothing mystical, nothing karmic, just consequences. Candace helped Sarah expand Second Chance's kitchen, and they renamed it Grace Table. Together, they started serving free meals to local children every Saturday, focusing on kids from struggling families, kids like Sarah's own. The sisters weren't close, not the way some siblings were. Too much damage had been done for that. But they were partners in kindness, and that was enough. The town pastor used their story in a Sunday sermon. Sarah didn't attend. She'd long since stopped going to church, but Candace recorded it and sent it to her. "Love doesn't run out," the pastor said in his gentle voice. "Only pride does." These two sisters learned that lesson at a terrible cost. But they learned it. And now they're teaching the rest of us. The congregation sat in silence, and several people were openly crying. Late one night, when the kids were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Sarah pulled out her journal. She'd been writing in it regularly since that first terrible night, documenting the journey from humiliation to healing. She turned to a blank page and began to write. "They told my kids to wait for crumbs. They treated them as less than, as afterthoughts, as children who should be grateful for whatever scraps they were given. And I walked away. People said I cursed them. People said I knew. People said I was cruel. But here's the truth. I saved my children by refusing to let them be diminished. I saved them by teaching them that they are worthy of a full plate, not leftovers. I saved them by showing them that walking away from cruelty isn't weakness. It's survival. The universe didn't punish my family. Their own pride and carelessness did. But somehow in the machinery of that tragedy, my children were spared. Not because of magic or karma, but because I chose their dignity over my family's approval. That's the lesson I hope they carry forever. You teach people how to treat you. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from those who can't see your worth. We built our own table. We filled our own plates. We created our own abundance. And we never, ever wait for crumbs." She closed the journal and looked around her small apartment. In the bedroom, she could hear Noah's soft snoring and Ellie's gentle breathing. On the refrigerator were their drawings, their school papers, their certificates of achievement. The walls were covered with photos. The kids at the park, the kids at the beach, the kids blowing out birthday candles. And in every photo, they were smiling. Not the careful, uncertain smiles of children walking on eggshells, but genuine, joyful, unguarded smiles. Sarah walked to their doorway and watched them sleep. Tomorrow, she'd wake up early and start baking for Grace Table. She'd spend the day preparing meals for families who needed them. She'd tuck her own children into bed with full bellies and fuller hearts. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she was young. It wasn't the life her parents had wanted for her. But it was good. It was honest. It was hers. And that was enough. The next morning, Sarah woke to find both kids already in the kitchen. Ellie was setting the table, carefully placing 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 sets of silverware. Noah was trying to help by arranging the napkins. "What's all this?" Sarah asked, smiling. "We're making breakfast," Ellie announced. "Well, you're making it. But we're helping." Sarah looked at the table they'd set. Everything equal, everything placed with care. Above it, on the wall, she'd hung a small wooden sign that Candace had given her as a peace offering. It was simple, hand-painted in blue letters, "We eat together." As Sarah made pancakes and her children chattered happily around her, she thought about that first dinner, the unequal plates, the cruel words, the humiliation. She thought about everything that had come after, the poisoning, the suspicion, the slow, painful journey toward healing. And she thought about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best versions of ourselves. Not because the trauma was necessary, not because suffering is noble, but because in surviving it, in refusing to let it break us, we discover reserves of strength we didn't know we had. Sarah served her children their pancakes. Equal portions, cooked with love, presented with care. They ate together at their small table, laughing and planning their day, and it was perfect in its ordinariness. Outside, the sun rose over their small town, casting golden light through the kitchen window. A new day, a new beginning. A life built not on crumbs, but on grace. And Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she would never go back to that other table. The one where love was measured in portions and worth was determined by favoritism. She had found something better. A place where everyone was welcomed, everyone was fed, and everyone, absolutely everyone, mattered. Later that afternoon, Martha called. They were talking more regularly now, carefully rebuilding something that might eventually look like a relationship. "I'm proud of you," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you've built with Grace Table, the way you've raised those children. You became everything I should have been." Sarah didn't know how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to say it wasn't too late, that Martha could still change. But another part of her knew that wasn't her responsibility anymore. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "That means a lot." After they hung up, Sarah stood on her small porch and watched her children play in the yard with the neighbor kids. They were laughing, sharing toys, taking turns. Already at 9 and 6, they understood something it had taken her decades to learn, that there's enough for everyone when you lead with generosity instead of scarcity. The local news van pulled up then. They were doing a feature on Grace Table and wanted to film the Saturday meal service. Sarah had agreed reluctantly, not because she wanted attention, but because she wanted the message to spread. The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes, set up her camera and began with the obvious question. "Why did you start Grace Table?" Sarah thought for a moment, then said, "Because I know what it's like to be hungry at a full table, and I wanted to make sure no child in this town ever feels that way again." "Some people say you're a hero for saving your children that night. How do you respond to that?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a mother who refused to let her children be treated as less than they are. That shouldn't be heroic. It should be normal." What would you say to other parents who find themselves in similar situations, where family dynamics are toxic, where favoritism is creating trauma? Sarah looked directly at the camera. "Walk away. I know it's hard. I know it feels like giving up. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is remove them from situations that diminish them. You can't control how other people treat you, but you can control whether you keep showing up for more." She paused, then added, "And when you walk away, build something better. Don't just survive, create. Create the family you wish you'd had. Create the table where everyone belongs. Create abundance where there was scarcity." The interview aired that evening, and by the next morning, Sarah's phone was flooded with messages. People sharing their own stories of family dysfunction, of walking away, of rebuilding. People offering to volunteer at Grace Table. People asking how they could start similar programs in their own communities. The movement grew beyond anything Sarah had imagined. Within 6 months, there were 12 Grace Tables operating in surrounding towns, all based on the same principle. Everyone eats, everyone matters, everyone has a place. A year later, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference for social workers and family counselors. She stood at the podium, looking out at the audience, and told her story. All of it. The painful parts and the healing parts. "They told my kids to wait for crumbs," she concluded. "But minutes after we left, they were begging for help. Not because I cursed them or punished them, but because consequences don't care about family hierarchy. The poison affected everyone who ate from that table, the favored and the forgotten alike." She paused, letting that sink in. "But here's what I learned. Walking away from that table wasn't loss. It was salvation. Not just physical salvation. My kids were spared from poisoning. But emotional and spiritual salvation, too. Because in walking away, I taught them the most important lesson I could ever give them. You are worthy. You deserve a full plate. You should never have to wait for crumbs. The audience rose in a standing ovation, and Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Proud, not just of what she'd survived, but of what she'd built from the ruins. That night, back in her apartment, Sarah tucked her children into bed. They were older now. Ellie was 10, Noah was 7, but they still wanted her to sit with them before sleep. "Mom?" Ellie asked in the darkness. "Do you remember that night at Grandma and Grandpa's house? When we had to leave?" Sarah's heart clenched. "I remember, baby." "I'm glad we left," Ellie said softly. "At the time I thought we did something wrong, but now I know we didn't. You were protecting us." "Always," Sarah whispered. "Always and forever." "And now we get to help other kids," Noah added from his bed. "At Grace's table, so they don't have to feel how we felt." Sarah kissed both their foreheads. "That's right. We turn our pain into purpose. That's how we heal." As she left their room, Sarah heard Noah say to Ellie, "We have the best mom." And Ellie replied, "We really do." Sarah stood in the hallway, tears streaming down her face. Good tears this time? Healing tears. She thought about the long journey from that dinner table to this moment. All the pain, all the growth, all the hard-won wisdom. She thought about Leonard's grave, and Martha's slow redemption, and Candace's transformation. She thought about the poison that had almost killed them all, and how her refusal to accept crumbs had accidentally saved her children's lives. But mostly she thought about this: that sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children isn't material wealth or social status, or even family connections. Sometimes the greatest gift is teaching them to walk away from places that diminish them and to build tables where everyone, absolutely everyone, gets to eat first. Sarah walked to her kitchen and looked at the small wooden sign above her table. "We eat together." 3 simple words that had become her family's entire philosophy. 3 words that had sparked a movement. 3 words that had transformed tragedy into grace. She smiled and turned out the lights, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because she had learned the ultimate truth. When you refuse to wait for crumbs, when you claim your worth and teach your children to claim theirs, you don't just survive. You feast. Here's a question for you. If protecting your children's dignity meant walking away from your family forever, could you do it? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about family, survival, and the unexpected ways the universe keeps score.